Ambition will push you to make things happen, just make sure it doesn't push you off a cliff. Wanna know who said that? I did. Except I was credited under the name Bimbly Todd. We all have things we want to do before we end up in a live leak video. Passion projects take time. Sometimes more than a weekend. But if you're passionate or crazy enough, you'll press onward, and eventually you'll finish your magnum opus. Robert Bob Peloni took over a decade of his life to make his magnum opus. It's called Bob's Game. It's a free-to-play puzzle game on PC. But it didn't start out that way. Bob's Game has been a semi-obscure internet folk legend for a while now. Most people who know about it think the story goes something like this. This guy made an RPG, and then he threw a hissy fit when Nintendo wouldn't let him put it on the DS. He destroyed his room and harassed people at the Nintendo store, and then he announced he was making a weird console. He went and quit after that, and I guess the game's on Steam now? This isn't exactly inaccurate, but it leaves a lot of things out. There was a version of the script that was a lot less in-depth, that only really scratched the surface of this story. And then I found this. This is the New Testament. It's basically Robert Peloni's life story. It's as long as you'd expect someone's life story to be. Bob has stated that a lot of the crazy things he's done over the course of Bob's Game's development were merely him pretending to be crazy. I don't think so. Not just the content, but the length of this webpage convinces me that this is not just someone acting crazy. Although he is declared legally sane at one point in the story, so maybe I'm crazy! But this is not the story of Robert Peloni, it's the story of Bob's Game. Although the New Testament is my primary source, I'm going to be skipping and skimming through some things that don't directly pertain to the game. Here we go! Here we go! Here we go! 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 If Robert Peloni is to be believed, he has been coding for quite a while, but his first foray into game development came when he was in a 9th grade Pascal class. He made a simple little demo where you click somewhere in the room and your character would move to that point. Bob's teacher was impressed by his demo, even questioning if he really made it. And this, and one more class in 11th grade, are Bob's only formal programming education. The rest was self-taught. Pretty admirable. Good job! Good job! Good job! Bob didn't finish high school.
No.
He ran away from home at age 17, and lived how you'd expect a teenage runaway to live. Eventually, Bob got a girlfriend. And a gamer girlfriend at that. If Portal was released around that time and Bob said, "The cake is a lie" to her, she would know what that meant. This gave Bob a newfound motivation to do something. He decided he'd make a game. As practice, Bob ripped some Samus sprites and made a demo where you can move her left and right. Hey, a future version of myself? While you're editing this, do you think you could add, like, a cool transition here? I know that might be a little much to ask, but I just... After creating a worthy sequel to Super Metroid, Bob started working on an original game called Zeldrug, a cross between Zelda and GTA. Let's just be honest here. Nintendo, you missed out. After making these demos, Bob messaged his programmer friend Phil, and was able to convince him into making a game company with him called PNB Soft. This is speculation, but I think the name stands for Phil N. Bob Software. Bob convinced Phil that if they can make some simple demos, they can get some money from publishers. But by Bob's own admission, he had no idea what he was talking about. Phil and Bob began brainstorming game ideas, and Bob eventually came up with an RPG with minigames. They named the project Button Mash, and changed the name of their company to Monkeys on Keyboards. Bob admits that Phil was a much better programmer than him. In the time it took for Bob to make a Tetris clone, Phil had already made a clone of Marble Madness, the Sliding Puzzle, and more. Bob would go on to make a clone of Puyo Puyo, and also this DDR clone that doesn't look like it works properly. After these demos, Phil began work on a graphics editor for Java. This editor would go on to be used for the majority of Bob's Game's development. After work on the editor was complete, Bob began working on creating the graphics and programming of the game. Here's a video of the alpha version. It has no color and this weird static in the background. It's like a game someone would make off a creepypasta. After work on the graphics editor was complete, Phil pretty much backed off the project entirely. Bob filed a trademark for the name Button Mash and continued to make graphics and program. Eventually, Bob changed the name of the game to Bob's Game and changed the name of his company to Densetsu Soft. Densetsu means legend in English, unless Google Translate is wrong. And that's really it in terms of major events relating to the game for a while. Bob just worked on the game for a while. But in 2008, Bob somehow found a contact from Nintendo and began a back-and-forth email conversation. What will this lead to? Well... Wait a minute, I'm getting there. Hold on. Despite Bob apparently lashing out at them, after he showed off his game running on the DS at a video conference, the business rep agreed to meet with him at GDC. So on the very last day of GDC, Bob was finally able to show people from Nintendo what he had been working on for their system. He met with the business rep and 2 other people from the company, showing off a vertical slice of Bob's game. He was nervous, the demo ended by crashing, and when asked if Bob would consider working with a team within Nintendo, he immediately said no. I suspect that this quick response stemmed from Bob's desire to have complete artistic control. It was probably also partly due to pride. Bob wanted to be known as that guy who made that huge RPG all by himself. This is evident in Bob's source of both inspiration and envy, Cave Story, a game made by one person that was actually released. After the meeting, as Bob was leaving, he decided to turn around and ask the rep for another chance to pitch the game, and surprisingly, he agreed. Now this dips into the personal life, but I feel it's good to include this as an explanation on how Bob was able to not be homeless for so long. A few months after GDC, Bob inherited $100,000 from a great aunt. Without this, I don't think things would have ended well for Bob. I doubt he'd want to get a real job, refusing to do anything but work on the game. Around that same time, the dad of a friend of Bob's suggested that he make a trailer for Bob's game. He dissuaded Bob from putting footage of the scratching on his walls. Good move, good move. So then Bob released the first public footage of Bob's game. It's a neat little video. It mainly shows off the engine's features rather than the game's content. Another trailer was released shortly after, and I guess you can say that it showed off more content. It's just a bunch of locations and characters without context. Wow, look at all these wacky guys. Who could forget the farmer who is trying to grow the world's largest eggplant and has a lottery addiction? This trailer also included a time-lapse of Bob working on the game, and according to him, there's a single frame of him masturbating. See if you can find it! Around this time, Bob began emailing a small publisher in a desperate attempt to get his game on the DS. They said they would rewrite the game to make it marketable. Although Bob was not terribly happy about working with the publisher, he still used them as an excuse to move to New Jersey. At the advice of the publisher, Bob began talking with a licensing representative from Nintendo. However, the stream of back-and-forth emails dried up a few weeks later. This drove Bob into a panic. Bob began forming an idea. He decided he would take the Nintendo rep's offer of another chance at pitching Bob's game, but not through talking to him, scheduling a date to meet, showing him another demo, nothing like that. Bob started by emailing the Nintendo rep, informing him that he was using his chance at another pitch now. Better to ask for forgiveness later than permission. This officially began Bob's protest publicity stunt ARG thing. Bob declared that he would lock himself in his room for 100 days, and until time was up or the big ad responded, the only link he'd had to the outside world was a phone to check his email with. Bob definitely got the attention he wanted, with several notable gaming news outlets picking up the story. Bob also sent some emails to people at Nintendo, insisting they make an open digital store similar to the App Store. Bob received no replies. And seeing how letting people put whatever the fuck they want on the App Store has worked out for Apple, this is unfortunate. So after claiming that he is the greatest game developer of all time, Bob concluded that the next logical step was to destroy his room and fake his own death. Apparently this was his transition to a Batman-esque supervillain. I mean, morality-wise, trashing up your own room and faking your own death are pretty neutral. Foolish, but neutral. But thanks to, quote, a worried European kid, unquote, and Bob's mother, the cops were sent to his house to make sure that everything was okay. After calmly explaining to the police that he was merely trying to become a video game villain, Bob was promptly taken to a psychiatric ward. Now, all jokes aside, there are things Bob says and does in the story that genuinely make me concerned for his mental health, but Bob left the psychiatric ward that same night with a document declaring him officially sane. Now yes, this does mean that Bob broke his pledge of remaining locked in his room for 100 days, but given the circumstances, I think we can let this instance slide. Although I don't think his multiple trips to a strip club should be given the same leniency. Despite secretly breaking his own rules, Bob's protest continued. He wrote stuff that was way too deep for anyone to understand, even myself. My forum quickly filled up with 15-year-old geniuses and prodigies, the only people on the internet who understood what the heck I was doing. Eventually, Bob decided to kick his protest into a higher gear. He began planning what became arguably the most infamous event of the protest, and maybe even this whole story. The ingredients for Bob's plan were as follows: spiked boots, business cards, a Nintendo executive's business card, Bob's Game posters, Bob's Game game cases, 20 sleepless hours, some Craigslist models. Mix those together and you'll get an awkward yet underwhelming stew called the Nintendo World Store Protest. After a recon mission to the store the previous day, Bob, his friend, and the Craigslist models paid the Nintendo World Store a visit they'd soon forget. Bob began the protest by handing out business cards to people in line. He then taped some posters to the front of the store, and then immediately took most of them down. He then put some Bob's Game boxes on the shelves, and scattered some of his business cards around the store. Except no he didn't, that part was fake. Eventually, a manager stepped in and ordered Bob's crew to leave. Thinking fast, Bob said he had a right to be there, and gave the manager the business card of the Nintendo rep he met at GDC. The manager tried calling to confirm this, but couldn't get through. Before leaving, Bob yelled, "Welcome to Bob's Game!" into the nearly empty store. The protest footage ends with Bob buying a DS Lite and playing Bob's Game on it. Bob added police sirens to this part to make it more exciting, even though there are clearly no police cars near the store. After the protest, Nintendo would officially confirm what I think we all expected at this point: they weren't going to give Bob access to the DS SDK. Following this, Bob made the Stage 80 video. It's basically a reenactment of how things went down with Nintendo, with a comically evil businessman in place of the Nintendo rep. The next video, Stage 90, is somehow even more self-indulgent. It's all about Bob finding out that the reason his game wasn't published wasn't his fault, it's because of an industry-wide conspiracy. Of course! And that was pretty much the end of Bob's protest. While it had garnered a lot of attention from people who were morbidly interested to see how it would all unfold, it certainly didn't help Bob get any closer to an official release on the DS. Shortly after releasing a demo of Bob's Game, Bob would officially end the protest. It was ended on the 100th day, but the protest was pretty much void at that point. After the protest ended, Bob wasn't really sure what to do with himself. He briefly worked on an iOS port of Bob's Game, but gave up due to a lack of motivation. Instead, Bob began work on a PC port, and would release a demo for it shortly after. Now I know this story has been pretty crazy so far, but I think you're gonna have a hard time believing this. This is probably gonna sound completely insane, but bear with me. Bob tried to get Bob's Game on Steam, and was denied. Yes, you heard that correctly. Valve, yes, that Valve, was asked if a game could be put on Steam, and said no. I know, it's hard to believe. But when Bob decided to attend GDC Austin, he spoke with a Sony rep who assured him that he would definitely be approved to publish on the PSP. Then Bob was rejected. At this point, Bob was understandably feeling pretty discouraged from working on Bob's game. Being rejected by 3 industry giants can't feel good. So Bob's mind turned to other things. Console-related things. Portable console with an open store for indie developers that cost $10 related things. The ND. The failed development of the ND isn't as public as Bob's games, but it's still pretty insane. Based on the trailers released to the Bob's Game YouTube channel, it's hard to discern what the ND is. Is it a real console? A proof of concept? A weird marketing stunt for Bob's game? A joke? Well, it's a little bit of everything, but I'll tell you right now that the ND got shockingly close to actually being distributed. After the Nintendo protest, Bob began hanging out with Tim Rogers, a writer for Kotaku. They began working on a pitch for the console after Bob came up with the idea. Tim wanted to call it the Action Button Mobile Entertainment Device, or ABMED for short. When Christmas time comes around, you ask Santa for a DS, a PSP, or an ABMED. Development on the console wouldn't begin right away. Bob would try once again to pitch his game in person, this time to the higher-ups at Excel Partners. It didn't go well. Interest in making the console was reignited after Bob attended a Nintendo keynote. For whatever reason, Satoru Iwata saying that engineers don't matter made Bob angry enough to make this strange video. Bob says that he didn't actually plan to make the ND, he was just trying to scare Nintendo. He thinks it worked though. After that, the ND would once again be shelved for a few months. But one day, Bob took a good long look at himself in the mirror, and he realized that he just had to follow through and make the ND a reality. And he hit the ground running. Shortly after his cinematic bathroom mirror epiphany, Bob began and finished work on a website for the ND within a few weeks. Then, Tim was able to get Bob into contact with a former toy company CEO and founder of a major Chinese trading company. Apparently they liked what Bob had to offer, and they began having Skype meetings daily. Then Bob finished an SDK for the console, he got people to make a 3D model of it, and he even began negotiations with Dingu, a Chinese manufacturer of cheap handhelds. Bob was able to talk them into a $25 selling price. His confidence at this point was pretty high, so he decided to email a bunch of venture capitalists. But this is where the ND's cavern began to cave. Bob received no replies from the venture capitalists, he was running out of money, Tim left to go work for a small gaming company, and the 3DS had just come out. But then Bob got some help from an old friend. Phil helped Bob decide what to use to create the technology that would connect ND users to each other through the internet. Then Bob began to work on what he calls a Java remake of Bob's game, although it sounds like something completely different. It was going to be a Club Penguin style game where you'd hang out in a place called ND World. You'd connect the ND to a PC and use it as the controller, sort of like the way you can use your 3DS as a controller in Smash. Then there was another several-month-long gap in ND development. Bob went back to work on the game, adding better lighting and network support, had a decent pitch to a millionaire, and he compares himself to Hitler for some reason, but the ND remained unworked on. After that, there was another long period of nothing. Then Bob returned once again with a series of rapid-fire milestones. You got payment, game streaming, and servers that could connect to each other for the ND, the completion of the Bob's Game MMO, and the replacement of the C version of Bob's Game with the Java version as the main version. It was also decided that the ND would no longer be a physical console, instead it would be something more akin to PlayStation Home. Remember PlayStation Home? Yeah. The story of the ND doesn't really have an ending, it just kinda stops. The ND is mentioned one more time after this in the New Testament, and the way Bob addresses it makes it seem like he has no plans of working on the project in the future. And with the ending of the ND, things would get a lot worse for Bob. I said at the beginning of this video that this is not the story of Bob, it's the story of Bob's game. But I feel like when you're telling the story of a game's development and the lead developer becomes homeless, you probably want to mention that. You'd also want to bring up any major changes in said developer's mental state. And, just a few paragraphs after writing about the completion of Bob's game, Bob takes a huge nosedive. Paragraphs and paragraphs about mind control, secret media cults, becoming a god. It's stereotypical stuff for an insane character in a TV show or a movie to say, but it's being said by a real person. In 2013, Bob set off for Seattle with $1,000, his cat, a strange assortment of objects, and no plans for where he'd be sleeping. After the money started to run out, Bob had no choice but to live in his car and eat food out of the trash. Bob later attempted suicide using the nitrogen tank he had brought with him. Fortunately, things briefly got better after this. Bob was able to get food stamps, his parents deposited some money in his account, and he was able to remain physically fit by regularly visiting a local gym. The only thing Bob could program with was a ThinkPad, which made it very hard to work on Bob's game. Bob tried to get the game on the Ouya at one point, but that fell through when he made a joke about eating from dumpsters. Well, it wasn't really a joke, I mean, it's not like he wasn't doing that. At this point, Bob had sorta given up on releasing Bob's game, the RPG. It was just too hard to work on. He eventually came to the decision to just release the puzzle game and leave it at that. Unfortunately, things took another turn for the worst. Bob lost his food stamps and began another long-winded and barely comprehensible rant. Afterwards, Bob brushes it off like it's nothing and ends the New Testament by talking about some loose thoughts and his Kickstarter. Yeah, Bob made a Kickstarter. He asked for $10,000 and made a little more than that. The campaign provides a basic summary of the development history. It hits all the main beats, the protests, the ND. He even briefly mentions his epiphanies about wizards and mind control and stuff. The campaign also breaks down Bob's game into 7 components. The ones I'm not going to mention are technical things like editors and APIs, uploads and the downloads. Bob's Game Classic is the RPG coded in C. It's the one all the trailers are for. Then there's Bob's Game Online. This is the MMO remake of Bob's Game made in Java, originally intended to be the hub for the ND. Lastly, there's Bob's Game, the puzzle game. The world's most advanced puzzle game. The only thing in this entire over a decade-long saga that saw the light of day. Bob mentions his hopes for it to be made a standard in computer and gaming history. Nope. Below that is a section called Miscellaneous Assets. This is a bunch of stuff relating to the development of the game, like design docs, changelogs, and emails. Bob mentions that all of these will eventually be made open source, for historical purposes, of course. How do you open source a poster? Next up are some stretch goals. If the campaign didn't hit $10,000, Bob would have given up entirely and gone to community college. It's kinda surprising to see that giving up was finally an option he was willing to consider. He's so persistent throughout this whole story, it makes the stretch goal kinda sad, honestly. The goal of the project is not to fund the development of Bob's game, it's for Bob to get enough money to buy a van he can live in, or an office if he gets $20,000. It would have taken $30,000 to directly support Bob's game's development. This would have allowed Bob to pay some volunteers, that's not how volunteering works, to help him with the art. For $40,000, Bob would have open-sourced the old engine. That's it. This next one is pretty wild. For $50,000, Bob would have released an arcade version of Bob's game. He would have made both the hardware and software, which would have allowed for the first Bob's Game Interdimensional Tournament. $75,000 would have gotten Bob to port Bob's game to consoles and iOS. Maybe. He'd at least try. $100,000 would have gotten this open source to everything. Bob would also release all those posters and design docs and private emails. You know how I said 50,000 would have gotten us Bob's Game Arcade Edition, which would have allowed for the first Bob's Game Interdimensional Tournament? Well, it turns out 50,000 wouldn't have guaranteed that the Bob's Game Interdimensional Tournament would have happened. It would have just made it possible. To ensure this world gets a chance to participate in the "alright, we get it, haha, funny joke," Bob would have needed $150,000. Apparently, there were more stretch goals after that, but they were deleted for being too unrealistic. And if something is unrealistic even by Bob's standards, you better believe that that something is unrealistic. I bet one of the stretch goals he deleted was getting enough money to buy the fucking sun. $5 gets you Bob's business card. That may sound lame until you hear that not only is it signed by Bob himself, it is also one of the business cards used in the Nintendo World Store protest. Hell yeah, man. $20 gets you the single-player campaign, and then we get a bit of a jump to $500, which puts you, yes, you, in Bob's Game. The delivery dates are pretty strange. The business cards are estimated for July of 2014, the campaign is scheduled for December 2014, and the NPC version of yourself is scheduled for December of 2015. I've never made an RPG before, but I mean, does it really take a full year to make a sprite, put it in-game, and write some dialogue? Square Enix, does it really take a year to do that? Comment below. But reviewing Bob's Kickstarter wasn't the main reason I wanted to look at it. After the project was funded, Bob posted 4 updates to his backers. The first one is backer only, and the other 2 are release announcements. But the second one is a small update about the game, and Bob's life in general. Bob starts by expressing his disappointment about the amount of money he received, which probably isn't the best way to begin an update. He goes on to say that instead of purchasing the van, he decided to move into an apartment. However, after a few months, he was back to his car. But then he says he went back to an apartment? I don't know. He ends the update by saying he might scale the game back to what it started out as, a single-player RPG. 8 months later, the alpha version of the puzzle game is released to itch.io for free. And finally, in February of 2017, the Bob's Game puzzle game was officially released on itch.io and Steam for free. The last update on the Kickstarter was the announcement of the puzzle game's release. The Bob's Game Twitter hasn't tweeted anything. The last time Bob logged into his Kickstarter account was April of 2017, and the last comment he made was in May of 2015. I am turning into God. As of this video, Bob's Game has been out for a little over a year, and was last updated in August of 2017. The release announcement seemed chipper. It was really short, but the tone is excited rather than desperate or exhausted. With no updates to the New Testament, the Kickstarter, or the Bob's Game Twitter account, who knows what Bob's up to now? My guess is that he's working, somewhere, maybe in a car, maybe in an apartment, on Bob's Game, the RPG. Who knows how much progress he's made, who knows when it'll be done, but if Bob has access to a computer, you better believe he's working on Bob's Game. Oh yeah, how's the puzzle game? Confusing as hell, the gameplay is basically just a series of other puzzle games smashed together. It's like a fake game you'd see a character in a TV show play. Do you know what the fuck's going on? Because I don't. Oh, okay, it's Dr. Mario. I know how to play Dr. Mario. No, I don't. You can make your own games, you can make your own game sequences, you can try desperately to figure out what's going on in the Vote Games menu. It's not for me. But I don't really care about the quality of the puzzle game. Before making this video, I thought Bob was just a crazy dude who was convinced he was the greatest game developer on Earth. But after reading the New Testament, I think Bob is just a victim of the events in his past. It probably doesn't need to be said, but I don't think leaving home at 17 with no source of income and without graduating high school did Bob much good. And all those weeks and months Bob spent in solitude while he worked on the game couldn't have been healthy either. I'm genuinely glad Bob is still alive and got to at least release something. I would like to play Bob's Game, the RPG, sometime in my life. mostly for closure, but the game itself doesn't look half bad. At the very least, it'll be interesting. Bob, if you're somehow watching this video, I hope not just for our sake, but your sake, that the RPG is eventually released. Thanks for watching this video. It took frickin' forever to edit and make because I'm lazy. Watch my other videos if you'd like, or leave. If you did like this video, you should probably actually like it on YouTube. It's kind of stupid to say, but it does actually help. So, if you wouldn't mind, you can do that. Or, okay, well, I'll see you later.